We have to let people know what Teach for America really is to combat the narrative that they're putting out there about, being these great saviors and making every conflict just about, how could you be mean to this nice Teach for America Corps member? Then making it personal, making it about individual Corps members, and not about the larger structure, which is enabling privatization of public ed.
Welcome to episode 11 of the Truth for America podcast. I'm Julian Vasquez Heilig, your host. I'm a professor at California State University, Sacramento. I'm also here live with my co-host.
I'm Jameson Brewer. I'm a recent PhD graduate of educational policy studies at the University of Illinois, where I'm currently an adjunct instructor along with being an adjunct instructor at DePaul University. And I'm happy to be here via satellite.
And we're taping live at the Save Our Schools Coalition for Action March and Conference at Howard University. Yesterday we marched from the Lincoln Memorial to the lawn on the south side of the White House. And we're joined by a variety of activists, educators, and other education stakeholders from across the United States. And so today, our host for the panel is Mr. David Green.
So my name's Dave Green. I taught for 4 decades. I worked with hundreds of talented educators. I even mentored 19 TFA Corps members, which is how I got information from the inside out about the hype and the hurt, which inspired me to write a book, which started out as essays and pieces of information for my mentees. And they said, you should put this together in a book. So I did. The book is called Doing the Right Thing, A Teacher Speaks. I'm not hyping it. It's 3 years old already. You can buy it if you want. It's an amalgam of experiences. And I think the core of this is that because of the experiences we've all had, I've had, students still have, that regardless of how innately talented a person might be or how motivated they are to give, to be this idealistic person, to give to society, if you don't have the training and you don't get that experience and you don't get the preparation, developing the best skills of a teacher to become a good teacher takes time. And that cannot be done in 5 weeks. You can't do that in a TFA 5-week session, which is actually, now that I think we've seen, and Julian has delved into this a lot more than I have, that's the tip of the iceberg. And that hopefully we'll be able to talk about a little bit more, how it's not just the inadequacy of TFA Corps members training, it's the whole of the TFA institution. Now, working with 19 Corps members, I have to tell you, they were a smorgasbord of people. Some people didn't belong there, and I said, you know what, I'm glad you're leaving, because they really didn't have the talent, nor were able to pick up the skills. But other people were truly good, and I had hoped they would stay on. 3 of them ended up going to med school. Well, okay, but at least they're doing something positive. They're not going off to do policy wrecking like many of them do. What I've discovered, and I hope we've all, is that you basically develop these skills through the mentoring of an existence and wisdom of more experienced people. Now, just recently in the Times this morning, Bank Street School of Education finally went on record that they recommend that there be a full year of residency. Really? We've been barking about that for years in terms of the actual preparation. If you're talking about a profession like teaching, which should be the same as a profession like medicine, you need a year of internship. You need a year of residency to working with competent master teachers to learn those skills. So finally, Bank Street got on the board today. So at any rate, to some degree, I was a little bit successful with those TFA kids that I mentored. But what I learned is that overall TFA is not. And it was not created in a vacuum. I recently read a book called Listen Liberal by Thomas Frank. And basically what he does is he traces the changes of the Democratic Party from the 1980s through today. What was once the party of working class people has now become a meritocratic party for elite professionals, led by elite professionals who only listen to their similar crowd and don't pay attention to the people they used to pay attention to. And this really happened in the 1980s. And they basically become a new elite professional policy-making class from Princeton, where Wendy Kaup came from, Stanford, Harvard, and Yale. Question is now, because of those backgrounds, is it any wonder that they were not able to get alliances with the very leaders of the Democratic Party who also came from those institutions and from that background, including our president, who, when it comes to education, has been a disappointment, to say the least. So, according to Frank, and this is a quote from him, the neoliberal manifesto, which is what he's calling it, called actually for a war on public school teachers so that we might get a better education system and more Route 28s and Silicon Valleys, the tech centers of the United States. He also said that the only critique the meritocracy class will acknowledge of American education is that it's not meritocratic enough. Thus, TFA became the perfect solution. After all, coming from where they did, getting the hype from where they did, and creating the disruption within schools the way they haven't really, they said, either verbatim or intimated, that the lowest of the meritocracy professional classes is teaching. They've said it. And thus it's their goal to get rid of the lowest of the professionals and replace them with this new temporary meritocratic group of people who then move on to other things. So we have live a more recent former corps member, and we have via video and via Skype 2 other former corps members who can share their experience and let you know what's going on. But before we get to them, I would like to first reintroduce Professor Julian Vasquez-Heilig, who is, I think, probably the most renowned expert on TFA we have floating around this country right now. So I'm going to give it over to him.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting Jameson and I to join this conversation here at the conference. I just want to remind, for those of you that have showed up late, we are actually taping a live episode 11 of our podcast, Truth for America. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I came to this, and then I want to talk a little bit about our podcast. Many years ago, I guess 5 or 6 years ago now, the National Education Policy Center, Kevin Wellner, came to me and asked me to write a research brief looking at all of the peer-reviewed research on Teach for America to that point. And we came away in that first brief, if you read the first brief, we came away with the idea that really, Teach for America did not perform as well as traditionally certified teachers when we looked at the research literature, and that we recommended that districts not hire Teach for America unless they were faced with teachers who had even less training than Teach for America teachers have, which I think is part of the real challenge of this conversation, which is when you have the choice of bad and worse, then sometimes you choose bad. But why are we giving poor children that option, right? So then a couple of years later, National Education Policy Center came back and asked me to revisit the Teach for America research literature, and we wrote a second brief called A Return to the Evidence. You can see both of those, a review of the evidence and a return to the evidence. If you just Google them, they're published by the National Education Policy Center. More recently, I've been blogging since 2012 on cloaking inequity. One of the things that I was thinking about is that, we spend a lot of time in our cars, we spend a lot of time exercising, we spend a lot of time cooking dinner, and it's impossible to read a blog when you're doing other active things. And many of us have iPhones or Android phones, or, we have access to YouTube, right? And so we thought that we wanted to have longer conversations. We wanted to provide voice to educators, former Teach for America alums, because Teach for America has millions of dollars to tell their story, millions and millions of dollars to tell their story. But we that are activists and are academics and other educators, we don't have those kind of resources. But with social and new media, we can open up those conversations to people who have different perspectives than Teach for America and provide them the opportunity to tell their counter-narrative. And so we've had 10 episodes so far in Teach for America. The first episode, we interviewed a principal from Houston one of the high schools that when I worked in Houston, in the Houston Independent School District, that I used to spend a lot of time in. And she actually talks about what it's like to be a principal of Teach for America teachers. It's actually the most listened to episode of the podcast. I think it's had 3,000 or 4,000 listeners across platforms. So on YouTube, I think it's had 1,000, but the Truth for America podcast is on iTunes and many other places, and so it has many, many other listens. The second one, we decided that we would debate Education Post. Education Post is a website that's been paid for by billionaire reformers. And so we brought on a journalist who wrote about her opinions and basically took issue with some things that Jameson and I said. And we had a very vigorous conversation. Then in the third podcast, we talked about alums reflected on their experience at the 25th anniversary event. So Gary Rubenstein and other folks talked about the critical folks, that they had a critical breakfast or a critical brunch, where folks in Teach for America, they said about 100 people gathered together to talk about their counter-narrative about Teach for America. And then the fourth episode, we talk about special education. One of the things that Teach for America likes to do in California is send their interns to teach special education, which are probably one of our most vulnerable populations. And they talked about how they started working in the Bay Area and their starting salary was $33,000 in the Bay Area. Not only was their starting salary $33,000, but Teach for America required them to spend another half of their salary on a master's degree from their partner institution. So essentially, before taxes, they were trying to live in the Bay Area on about $12,000 a year. Now, this is a story I don't think anybody has told about Teach for America to this point. And when the alums told me that, I was in absolute shock.
They're working full-time on that.
Working full-time, and basically their take-home before taxes was around 13 or 14 is what they told us. Then we talked about two books, the bestseller books in episode 5. And in that episode, there's been books that alums have written, counter-narrative books. You can find them on Amazon if you Teach for America, counter-narrative. We talk with the authors of those books. In episode 6, we brought on Teach for America alums of color to talk about their perspectives on diversity in the core, the framing of diversity in the core. Then we taped live from the National Network for Public Education Conference with Diane Ravitch. Diane Ravitch gave some of her thoughts about Teach for America in episode 7. And then in episode 8, I think it was, we talked about the first year TFA experience. In this episode, a Teach for America teacher told us that the charter school actually required her to build the school the summer before she started. Build the school. And I asked her, did you get a general contractor license while you were at Institute? And these are true stories, folks. I mean, these are the stories that the Teach for America alums are telling us. They actually come to us. We don't often solicit people. When people come to me with stories and I say, would you like to tell that story on the podcast? And then episode 9, we actually talk with people who have been involved with Teach for America from near the beginning. For example, Professor Ladwick, who's now in Australia, actually wrote the first evaluation of Teach for America in the early 1990s. And he talked about his interactions with TFA decades ago, how their thinking was, their conversations at that time. And then finally, Teach for America has been kicked out of San Francisco, which is quite surprising. That's not to say that they won't return to San Francisco in the future. But right now, they're on hiatus. And so we actually had on Lita Blanc, who is one of the union leaders, and she talked about her perspective on that change in San Francisco and the move away from sending teachers. And I asked her specifically, where do Teach for America teachers go in your district? And she said, to the poor schools with the highest turnover. So we are sending the least trained. The latest reports from Institute are about 18 hours in the classroom before, and we often talk about 5 weeks, but they really only have 18 hours in most institutes before they go into the classroom. With no specific training, for example, in special ed. One on the podcast about special ed, they said that they might have had a couple of hours. They didn't actually know how to write IEPs when they got to the school. They knew what they were, but they didn't know how to write them. So I think that the podcast is a place where people can express their thinking, people who are affiliated with TFA primarily, but other educators and researchers. And we've probably had between 10 and 15,000 listeners. And this is a very specific narrow podcast. It's only about Teach for America. It's only about Teach for America. So I think that we've been able on this new platform, and I should also say that the Network for Public Education sponsors the podcast. Diane Ravitch has also posted the first, I think, 5 or 6 episodes on her blog. So I just wanted to quickly talk about those two things, the research that we've reviewed and the new podcast and some of the stories. So I invite you to go to iTunes and YouTube and Google Play and really everywhere else to check out our podcast, Truth for America. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Julian. I think now's a good time, since Julian referenced him, to have Gary Rubenstein speak to you. He sent me a video he made via iTunes, so give me a second, and I'll bring Gary up, and we can hear his 24-year-old story of dealing with how TFA deals with people who criticize it.
I'm Gary Rubenstein. I was a Teach for America core member in 1991, so that's 25 years ago. I've been offering Teach for America critique for 24 of the last 25 years. They have been ignoring that critique for 24 of those 24 years. I want to look back at the way Teach for America responds to criticism in general, and to me specifically. I think the first major criticism of Teach for America publicly was when Linda Darling-Hammond wrote an article in Phi Delta Kappan called Who Will Speak for the Children? And this, Wendy Kopp responded to this article, and she did it in what's become sort of classic Teach for America style, which is to start by either denying that there is a problem, or by saying that the problem is no longer relevant, that it used to be a problem, but now they fixed it. And then deflect, where they talk about other things that are good about Teach for America and sort of changing the subject. This has become a pattern throughout the years, the way that Teach for America deals with different critique. Now, in 2011, I went to the 20-year Alumni Summit, and it was there that I learned and realized that Teach for America had gotten so involved with the charter school movement and with people like Joel Klein or Michelle Rhee was an alum, and the whole waiting for Superman thing. And when I left that conference, I went and did some research and wrote a blog post that was called Why I Did TFA and Why You Shouldn't. And this post got a lot of attention, and it actually got me invited to speak on NPR. So I went to NPR, and I said that, yes, the training is still bad in Teach for America, but even worse is the way that Teach for America has been promoting these alumni leaders who I think are really reckless and not helping things. Teach for America recorded a response to what I said, and as typical, they said, well, his critique was valid maybe 10 years ago, but it's not valid anymore. But these were things that had just happened, recently with the Teach for America leaders, alumni becoming leaders. So it was not fair to say that. And then deflecting and going on to some other things that Teach for America does do well. So I continued to blog and to write criticisms to Teach for America, and they would not ever respond to me like publicly, like on Twitter or things like that. Sometimes a staff member from Teach for America would start to mix it up with me a bit, and then they would say something that they regretted, and then they would kind of disappear, and then a new person would come in. But in general, over the years, they would not engage with me. A new tactic I noticed from TFA, where not only do they deny and deflect, but they've started to try to, I guess, destroy or defame or discredit their critics. A recent example of this is I wrote a chapter in the Teach for America Counter Narratives book, and there were 20 chapters in this book. And the way that Teach for America announced to their alumni in their alumni email blast about this book, they said, the book, Teach for America Counter Narratives, collects essays from about 20 of the 50,000 Teach for America core members. So they didn't have to say out of the 50,000, but they said it to say, well, look, it's just 20 people out of 50,000. It's nothing. It's not relevant. It's not important. They don't know how many people agree with the 20 people who wrote those chapters, and they don't know how many other chapters were rejected. I mean, the book can't have 50,000 chapters in it. So that's just an example of how they try to sort of marginalize critics and sort of defame them. Most recently, I noticed an organization popped up, a nonprofit. It's sort of not, they don't claim to be affiliated with Teach for America, but they're called Core Knowledge. And they bill themselves as, on their Twitter page, it's like Luther the Anger Translator, but by and for TFA alumni. That's kind of like the id of Teach for America. And I found one day an article about me called the Misanthropy of Gary Rubenstein. This was an entire article about me. It starts off saying, if you don't know who he is, you don't want to know, because he's the sort of person who will only erode your faith in the essential goodness of humanity. And this is because I wrote a blog post saying that Louisiana's AP scores, which were publicly available, were not very good, even though they were trying to say that they were very good. So I wrote to Teach for America, and I said, I think that Teach for America should sort of publicly denounce activity like this, and if not, I consider it like you're condoning it. And a high-level person wrote back to me and said, well, just as you have your strong opinions, they have theirs, and just as you have the right to say what you say, they have the right to say what they have to say. So just last year, there was the 25th reunion, and I wrote to them about 14 months before that event, volunteering to be on some sort of panel. And I said maybe there could be some kind of debate where you have reformers and critics, and it would be great. People would like it. I said not only that, it would give critics feeling some validation, and maybe they wouldn't critique Teach for America through blogs and blog posts, and it's just good. So first they wrote back a few months later, well, we haven't started scheduling yet. And then a few months after that, they wrote back again and said, oh, we've done all the scheduling, now it's too late. And they said, but you're going to be happy, there's a lot of balance. But there wasn't. I went to the conference, I went to a workshop about teachers talking about controversial issues in education, and it was like 9 charter teachers and 1 district teacher, and it was not balanced at all. But they did not want my point of view out there. I did get the last laugh when the Washington Post came to the summit and interviewed me and wrote an article about me called "He's the Stinkweed at the Teach for America Garden Party." And it was a very favorable article, and I'm proud that they called me the Stinkweed. The most recent thing, and the last thing I want to talk about, is I noticed on Education Week's Twitter feed these really glowing articles about Teach for America. Here's one: too many kids zip code becomes destiny. Here's how Teach for America is helping change that. And someone pointed out to me that if you look really closely, there are these hashtags, sponsor and ad. So Teach for America's new proactive approach is to buy good PR. And that's what they do. So basically, Teach for America will say what they need to say to keep doing what they're doing. They don't want to change. They don't feel like they have to change. And I would advise them that instead of trying to figure out slicker ways to get good PR, to just change what you're doing. You won't need PR. You'll just be doing the right thing. So that's what I have to say. I'm sorry I can't be there. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Well, thank you, Gary. So just so that you know, Gary Rubenstein is still teaching high school math in New York City. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing that he points out is a bigger picture question, which is about policy members. Have any of you heard of an organization called LEE? Okay, Leadership for Education. And again, he latches on to this hashtag sponsor, hashtag ad. But even before they figured that out, they figured out how to use great language to market themselves. And so LEE is the Leadership for Educational Equity, word number 1. I'm going to read you a little bit from their website, just how they describe themselves and their mission, and you'll see the difficulties that people like Gary and Julian and I and Emma have been going through and trying to deal with them. So this is how they describe themselves. If you actually recognize one of those flash words that is bullshit, you can raise your hand so we all recognize it. We are a nonpartisan, there we go, organization dedicated to empowering Teach for America core members and alumni to, quote, grow as leaders in their communities and help build the movement for educational equity. That's their introductory paragraph. Their mission statement is a very short sentence: to inspire a diverse, enduring movement of leaders to engage civically within their communities to end the injustice of educational inequity. That's how they sell themselves to lots of idealistic college kids who say, wow, I want to do that. I want to get involved and I want to go into these communities or go back to my community in some cases and help this movement to end this inequity in education. So I think that actually might be a good segue to Emma, who once upon a time was one of those naive college students and no longer is. So Emma, why don't you tell us your story in Detroit, right?
Yes, Detroit. Hi, everybody. So my name is Emma Howland Bolton, and I've been teaching. I'll be starting my 7th year in Detroit Public Schools in the fall, or whatever our district is going to be called in the fall. But I'm originally from upstate New York, and I don't want to talk too long because we don't need more white people talking about what's happening in black and brown communities. But I do feel like the experience that I had is useful, and it did kind of catapult me into where I am today. So I will try to be brief. So basically, when I joined Teach for America, I had like a very outdated idea of what the organization was about. My impression was that we were placed in communities that could not attract teachers. So my thinking was that I am at least a living, breathing human, and so better than no teachers at all. Of course, that's not the case at all. I'm not sure that was ever the case. Teach for America has a growth model. They are all about expanding. There's now Teach for All, which is in 40 countries around the world, doing the exact same thing that they've done here in the United States, which is essentially dismantling teachers' unions and frankly, stealing education from predominantly youth of color and poor youth. So doesn't sound like anything anyone wants to be a part of. That thing you heard from Lee sounded so great, but obviously the reality is pretty rough. So, backing up just a little bit, I think kind of the central conflict that we're all facing is public education a right that, should be equitably distributed to everyone, or is it a privilege that only the lucky people get to access? And I think the people in this room would argue that it is a right that everyone deserves, and in fact, it's the only way that our democracy can function and that we can hold our heads up high as human beings. But a lot of people along the way have decided that actually education is a $600 billion industry that they want to capitalize on. And so that's what we're seeing. The charter movement came out of unions. It was a good idea in the beginning. It was supposed to be about, kids getting better education and teachers having more freedom to teach in a way that kids need to learn and want to learn. And it was a great idea, and it was turned into something else by folks who wanted to make money. And so that's kind of the situation that we have now. And the conflict between charter and public schools is kind of a distraction, actually. But when we look at that central conflict, is public education a right, or is public education something that a few people are going to make a lot of money off of and the rest of us are going to suffer as the result? Teach for America is on the wrong side of that conflict. But both sides have narratives, right? There are true narratives that come from students who have only ever had Teach for America teachers, or parents who have, tried to find schools where they have teachers who have actually been educated about childhood development, or who have had more than 18 hours of, classroom time before taking the incredibly sacred and important charge of educating their children. So those are the people who we really want to listen to, and those are the narratives that are true narratives. But Teach for America has a very powerful machine behind it, and their narratives sound great. And they, build themselves as being a reflective organization. They're constantly surveying core members to find out how they feel and blah, 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 blah. And you're actually forced to take these surveys. But they are not a reflective organization. And they have a mission that is utterly destructive to communities and to schools, which are obviously a part of the community. So I want to just be very clear about that as an alum. I have seen firsthand the way that this has happened, and Detroit is an excellent example. New Orleans is an excellent example, and we have lots of other places where I'm sure we're all from that are excellent examples of the way that Teach for America is on the wrong side of this central conflict. And they're more dangerous because of the insidious way that they're on the wrong side, because they bill themselves as being something other than what they are. This narrative that Teach for America has is appealing to people in a way that's also really destructive, because they appeal to people in a way that necessitates that change will never happen. Change does not come in from the outside. Change does not look like a white college-educated person who's never been to this city before. Those are not the people who are well acquainted with the issues, and therefore those are not the people who are going to be able to come up with solutions that actually work. But by investing in that narrative, we actually perpetuate this damaging cycle of people believing that they can't change what's in their communities. We put, these teachers in front of kids, and that sends a message, right? When you look up on your teacher as this person who has been trained in the Lee Cantor style of classroom management, which is totally dehumanizing. It uses proximity. All Teach for America teachers are trained in a Lee Cantor style of classroom management. It uses intimidation, proximity, volume, all of these different tactics, and you should look it up if you want to. I'm sure he has YouTube videos. He's a white man from the South who seems not to realize that his background and his person and the way that he wants to teach children is like deeply offensive and rooted in white supremacy. But maybe someone can tell him that. Lee Cantor, check it out. But all Teach for America teachers have to be trained in this style of classroom management. So, I'll talk about Detroit. I'm going on too long, so I'll cut it off. I'll talk about Detroit.
I want to talk about Detroit.
But before I talk about Detroit, I want to talk about what happened in New Orleans, because Detroit is following the model of what happened in New Orleans, and other cities are following what's happening in Detroit. And the exact same people, those people that were brought up by Lee and other organizations, those people are just moving around the city doing the same thing everywhere. So in New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina happened, and communities were told, you're going to get new schools and new books, and you're going to get all this great stuff, and we're going to reinvigorate education. And the only thing that they got was new teachers, and these teachers were predominantly white. They were predominantly Teach for America teachers. They were predominantly not from New Orleans, and they came in with this Lee Cantor style of classroom management, which is dehumanizing to both the student and the teacher. It removes the teacher from their real role, which is as someone who has a relationship to you, who cares about you, who believes in you and who you are and sees your inherent value. They are removed from that by this style of classroom management. And that's what they got in New Orleans. And actually the teachers in New Orleans did eventually win wrongful termination suit 7 years later, though, so the damage has been done. Because a year to a child, a day to a child, is a very long and important time. So that's what happened in New Orleans, and the same thing happened in Detroit. So when I joined Teach for America, I had this outdated idea that I would be stepping into a classroom where if I was not there would not be a teacher, and that's my fault, because the internet provides us with a number of counter-narratives. And so I was originally going to go to the Mississippi Delta, where there is a teacher shortage, and before I was going to go, I actually received word that they had just opened a new site in Detroit, and since I was willing to go to the Mississippi Delta, perhaps I would be willing to go to Detroit, which was a completely baffling sentiment to me, but I said yes, and I went to Detroit, and Detroit had 1,000 teachers out of work. Detroit was in the midst of emergency management and the crisis that is begot by emergency management. Detroit had a situation where, upwards of 80% of people of color in the state of Michigan did not have access to a viable local vote. So all of this is not just something that happened to be happening at the same time that Teach for America was coming into the city. This was because of these conditions, Teach for America was able to go into the city. And in fact was welcomed into the city because they wanted to replace those teachers with this, temporary teaching force that constantly rolls over, that will do what they're told, essentially. Teach for America teachers are inoculated against veteran teachers. They are told not to talk to veteran teachers. They are told to stay out of the teacher's lounge. They are told that veteran teachers are the enemy, much the same way that I think parents are pitted against each other between charter school parents and public school parents, right? They're told the other is the enemy. Don't even talk to them because they have bad ideas and they'll fill your head with negativity, right? This is something that is relentless, this relentless positivity of Teach for America, right? Everything is positive, everything's wonderful. The history of what is happening with education privatization is not positive, and I'm not going to stand here and talk about all the great things I'm doing in my classroom out of context. And so the context was really lacking. So when I got to Detroit, no context at at all. I was like, what am I doing? I'm a scab. And I was actually convinced to stay in my position by an AFT organizer who was like, well, maybe you can make change from the inside. That did not happen. But I did try. After Teach for America, many of us alums organized because we saw kind of what was happening. We saw the fact that, in order to bring us in, they had actually brought Teach for America 10 years before and then been kicked out. And to bring Teach for America back, they had to change the state constitution in order to reduce the necessary criteria for becoming a teacher, reduce someone has to do to be certified to be a teacher. They had to change the state constitution. And in other states where Teach for America is really powerful, like New Orleans, they didn't have to do that because there are 3 states in the union that don't have compulsory education laws. And that's Louisiana is one of them. I think Mississippi is another one, and I forget the third one. But Michigan actually just passed legislation saying that we also do not have a responsibility to educate children. So that central conflict comes back, right? Is education a right? Or is education something just there to be capitalized on by the very few and the very unethical? So after that, there were a number of ways that we organized. A number of Teach for America teachers do not live in the communities where they work, but many of us did. And I live 2 blocks from the school that I work at. I walk to school every day. I coach basketball. I try to be there and do what I intended to do. Because, I've done a lot of organizing and activism that was ineffective and that looked like going around the country and doing different things and never really knowing what's going on. So how could you ever really know how to respond? And when I decided to become a teacher, I knew that this was a style of organizing that matters and works, and that is going to a community, and that is your community, and you find out what they're doing, and you find out how you can help. And if you can't help, then that's not the place you should be, right? But it's not possible through the TFA model. Essentially, a bunch of alumni got together, and at the Free Minds, Free People conference in Chicago, anybody go to that?
I went to the one in Oakland.
Okay, there was one in Chicago a couple years ago, and a bunch of TFA alums got together and were kind of like, okay, this has to stop. We have to elevate parent voice, we have to elevate student voice, we have to let these narratives come out, we have to let people know what Teach for America really is to combat the narrative that they're putting out there about, being these great saviors and making every conflict just about like, how could you be mean to this nice Teach for America core member? Then making it personal, making it about individual core members and not about the larger structure, which is enabling privatization of public ed. We formed a group in Detroit, and there were groups all over the country that have formed that are alumni groups that are working to dismantle TFA in whatever city it's already in and inoculate cities that it hasn't moved to. So find ways to let cities know before Teach for America comes in with their big machine and their apparatus and their narrative, letting those cities know before that happens what Teach for America really is. And I think, it's helpful that it comes from alums who know, but it's also helpful to bring in parents and teachers who have actually experienced firsthand the real effects of Teach for America. So that organization was called Learn with Detroit instead of Teach for America. We hosted events where community members were able to speak to kind of the context and history of education in Detroit. We hosted parties where we would go to ProSat, which is this professional development thing that Teach for America teachers have to do all the time. Is really soul-sucking and terrible. We pass out flyers to come to this party. We get them in the party, and we do some critical analysis of what the heck is going on with public education and where you fit in it, and what our job is to do next. So we had parties like that. Teach for America, of course, is rabid in their response and totally blacklisted all of us and tried to make it this whole big thing. But a lot of really good things have come out of that. We had a reading group. So there are people that are organizing against it. But the best thing that we can do really is just to find people who are legitimately addressing that central conflict of public ed versus privatization and support them. And that's the best thing that I think that alums can do. Yeah, don't buy the narrative.
You can tell I'm as passionate about this, right? and what she points out is really important about getting in early, and because they work deals. This is all about,
yes.
and I'm kind of leading into Jameson. To them, it's not just the hype and the language and the marketing. It's about the deal making and understanding that districts in cities, small, medium, and large, are looking to make their budgets smaller. And the best way to make a smaller budget is to get rid of experienced teachers who, although they're not getting paid much, are still getting paid far more than a first or second year person is going to be, who, by the way, because they only last 2 years, never get vested in pensions.
Yep.
So short term, they're saving money, and long term, they're saving a huge amount of money. So the idea is to get in there and convince cities. Seattle went through this same thing a couple of years ago as well, where they had to wait a board of education election cycle to get the right people in. So one of the things you can do is, wherever you are, if there's a board of education, get your people elected so that when the time comes, that contract deal making doesn't happen. So with that in mind, here's Jameson.
I think it's important to point out that it's true that from the beginning, Teach for America, the message to core members, even as on their first day of induction, as it's called, Teach for America expresses that the work that alumni do is the most important work that Teach for America does, right? So that immediately situates their role as teachers as less important and certainly temporary, right? And something else that Gary said, Teach for America's critique of Teach for America counter-narratives, for example, that I co-edited with Kathleen Deveray at the University of Georgia. There was 20 out of 50,000, basically disgruntled former employees, and that our critiques were outdated. And it's couched within this narrative, and I think that, it was just said that Teach for America likes to say that they're so reflective, right? They're so interested in learning from surveys and all these, the feedback that they get from core members, that if you critique the organization at 9 a.m., that critique is outdated by 9:01 because they've already instituted all the changes that they need to make because they're so very reflective. I'm a traditionally trained teacher. I was forced to join Teach for America in 2010 because the state of Georgia had instituted what was effectively a hiring freeze in the state. I knew nothing about TFA before going in. And so something that I want to talk about and some of the work that I've been doing recently, myself with my dissertation, but also with a few colleagues as well, is looking at how Teach for America actually gets jobs, right? It's something people have talked about for the last 25 years, that TFA has been in existence. There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence that TFA places teacher or their core members within cities, and as a result, veteran teachers are laid off, right? So we've had a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we're really starting to do some empirical analysis of how that works out. And I've became interested in it because I came to Teach for America with a degree in education and a license to teach license to teach secondary history. But because I checked a little box on the TFA application that I would be interested in learning more about special education, I was brought in to Teach for America and slated to teach elementary special education, something that I was not trained to do and something I wasn't licensed to do. And I think Julian pointed earlier, Teach for America core members who are slated to teach special education get about 2 hours of special education training, right? Which I think we all agree is not sufficient and likely constitutes a lot of legal issues since IEPs are legal documents. And for me, I went to the pseudo job fair that TFA had for its core members. And I'll circle back to the hiring because they present a facade that there is a hiring process, right? You go into this very exclusive job fair. You already have pre-scheduled interviews with already predetermined set of principals, and it creates the illusion, both for the core member and really for the principals, that there's choice, right? But there's really not. Principals are told that they have to take X amount of core members, so say it's 2, but they're free to interview 10 core members. They get to pick out of those 10, so there's the illusion of choice, but they have to take 2, right? So I had a conversation with a principal who had an opening for a history position. I went to her. I wasn't supposed to go to her. She wasn't on my scheduled list of interviews. And we had a nice conversation. She wanted to hire me because I was licensed, I'd student taught, but she couldn't because Teach for America told her that I was already slated for another school for elementary special education, right? So, TFA from the beginning has really pushed this narrative that the organization wants to ameliorate teacher shortages, right? That the nation's struggling to fill, nobody wants to teach in these schools, right? And there's some racial language there, undertones of these schools and those kids, which is a conversation we can have. But that really the case, right? As was just said, especially after the recession, it became clear that in most of these districts and regions and urban centers, we don't really have teacher shortages. We have excess and surplus of teachers because so many teachers are being laid off. And that's really forced TFA to stop talking about attending to teacher shortages, and they've shifted their narrative, right? So let me give you, so this is a quote from Wendy Kopp's thesis. Teach for America, that's not what she called it in her thesis, but her teacher core, would bill itself as an emergency response to a shortage of experienced, qualified teachers, and would therefore not be telling the nation that its inexperienced members were preferable to or as qualified as experienced teachers, right? So that's from her thesis in 1989. I think if you're familiar at all with Teach for America, particularly in the last 10 years, I think that you would have a hard time understanding that initial disposition about we're not saying that our inexperienced members are more preferable. We're not saying they're qualified. Certainly that narrative has switched, right? Because as teachers are being laid off in Chicago and Atlanta and all these other places, and Teach for America continue to grow, the narrative had switched to one where principals are being given an option between Teach for America and between non-Teach for America. And if a core member is hired, it's because that principal chose to hire a Teach for America teacher over the non-TFA teacher, right? And so again, there's a lot of false choice within the actual process of that decision, but actually suggesting that principals have the full autonomy to choose between TFA and non-TFA is exceedingly false, right? And so it really comes down to special contracts, the memorandum of understandings that Teach for America enters into with districts, right? And it sort of came out in Seattle a couple of years ago when there was a lot of debate about renewing the contract, and recently in San Francisco. But for decades, and even to this day, even after, so I did a study, I was fortunate to do it myself, Carrie Kretschmar, Beth Sondell, Sarah Ishmael, Megan Manfra, we're all TFA alums. We published a study at Educational Policy Analysis Archives where we looked at 49 of these special contracts. Teach for America immediately issued a response saying, no, we don't have special contracts. Really, because it doesn't say special contract at the top, TFA sort of gets away with saying, we don't have special contracts. But they do have special contracts that stipulate that core members are actually given a lot of specialized treatment. They're given a lot of privileges in the hiring process. And so here are some of the things that these contracts stipulate. That core members have reserved and protected positions, that their hiring are not restricted, and I'm quoting here, to so-called shortage areas, and are hired across content areas, including special education, and they often get a 2-year guaranteed contract, right? Which for any of us, or for any of you in the room who are educators, you know that educators get a 1-year contract, not 2. Teach for America core members are increasingly placed in charters. They're privileged in pathways to leadership positions, right? So through Leadership for Educational Equity, but also through principal preparation pipelines, right? And so it's this whole idea of getting core members into the classroom. Something, if you're familiar with David Berliner and Bruce Biddle's work in the 90s, they talked about the manufactured crisis, right? That really gave way to the privatization or the ramping up of the privatization of public education to create this crisis. Well, Teach for America has a manufactured expertise, right? You get inexperienced core members with 18 hours of training, or if they're in special education, they also have an extra 2 hours of special ed training. You put them in the classroom, and then they become education and policy experts, right? And you quickly move them into these leadership positions. You move them into principal positions. You move them into state superintendent positions like John White in Louisiana, right? All these other places. You get them in positions where they're not only able to reinforce and expand these special contracts with school districts, between school districts and TFA, but now they're the principals. Now they're in a position to make these hiring decisions, right? And so it becomes a self-fulfilling process. So let me give you just very quickly, this is some of the language that we found in the contract, and so I'm quoting here. Although TFA will work in good faith with the school district to provide teachers who meet specific grade level, subject matter, or other criteria specified by the school district shall hire every qualified teacher made available by TFA pursuant to this agreement, whether or not such teacher meets specific criteria. And the school district shall use its reasonable best efforts to hire teachers across the full range of grade levels and subject matters, including in non-critical or non-shortage areas. So I'll break that down for you. Teach for America will do their best to supply teachers according to the district's needs, but regardless of whether they actually fit those needs. So that could be a core member with a background in biology who is told, the district gets told, well, you have to hire this person to teach French or whatever it is, right? Being overly hyperbolic in this case. But the contract requires that no matter the background of these teachers, they must be hired, and they must be hired across all of these different content areas. It's something that struck me. I also attended the TFA summit along with Gary, and it really troubled me to hear TFA's now sole CEO talking about how proud, of course, she was of the work that had been done in the last 25 years, but more specifically, how she was looking forward to the next 25 years of TFA and the explosive and expansive growth that TFA is just supposed to have and should have, right? And it struck me as this is a nonprofit organization that, side note, has over $500 million in net assets, meaning if they sold everything, they would have $500 million in cash. That's a little troubling, more than the public broadcasting service. I mean, lots of other big nonprofits, that's more money than they have. And so it really brings in the question of, is it really nonprofit? And why are districts paying $4,000 or $5,000 per core member per year when TFA has $500 million in savings? But what is really troubling about this idea of projecting growth forward, if TFA is really interested in attending to some of the inequalities in our school systems, I don't think that they would be celebrating the possibility of growing for the next quarter century. You would see the organization talking about putting themselves out of business, right? We don't see cancer institutes talking about how excited they are about growing and being able to continue to do research over the next 50 years. They talk about the end. They talk about putting themselves out of business. And I think that that's something for me. I think that there's an ethic to that. But for the rest of us, as taxpayers, Teach for America is federally funded. This is an organization, again, $500 million in net assets, seeking to grow, talking about ending educational inequity. But if they did that, they wouldn't be talking about growing. And for me, and as talked about with Lee Cantor's sort of discipline, classroom management, Teach for America is not interested in liberation pedagogy. They're not interested in doing things that will actually end systemic inequalities, both economics and racial inequalities. It put themselves out of business, and you wouldn't hear the CEO talking about explosive growth, right? So we need pedagogical approaches to the classroom that are that have a deep root in liberation and not in oppression. So thank you.
Thank you, Jameson. I think because just quickly, we're going to go right to Tina, who's going to talk a little bit more about the special ed, and then we're going to conclude.
Be as brief as I can. My name is Tina Andres, and I'm a teacher from Santa Ana Unified School District, and that's a district in Orange County, California, kind of near Disneyland. It's a district of over 50,000 students, predominantly low-income Hispanic students. I also live in the district, and I'm a parent in the district, and I'm a parent of 2 students, one of them a special ed student. In May of 2015, I was in my classroom, and during the break, my vice president of my union showed up and handed me a piece of paper in my crowded classroom during our break. I looked at the piece of paper, and it was a board agenda item to approve TFA for our special education students in 4 days. It was buried in board minutes, board agenda that was 500 pages long. It was on approximately page 300. The only way we knew anything about it was this man goes through these board agendas with a fine-tooth comb and has 3 days to get into action. So he brought it immediately to me. I am on the BAT board of directors, so I have information about TFA, and I had been learning about TFA for several years, but they had never been used in my district. I saw this piece of paper, and it said that we were going to have TFA for the following fall. And it looked to me that it was a done deal. So I decided it was not a done deal. And I moved into action. I did not know this man over here, Julian, at that time, but I frantically searched everywhere I could, and within 30 minutes, I was connected to Julian. And he helped me jump into action, create an action plan. I didn't sleep for 4 days. Mm-hmm. I was up, making actions. The BATS went into action immediately. I knew this was not just my district, my students. I'm starting my 30th year in that district coming up this year. I love those students, but this was also my daughter. So it was very important to me. Anyway, I get emotional about that. We decided that we were going to create actions. We got the BATS going in, calling our school district, calling our board members, calling our superintendent. We got the teachers in our district calling. Within 3 days, they had received hundreds of phone calls. They don't ever receive hundreds of phone calls. So we had a plan. We were going to the school board meeting. We had about a dozen speakers ready to present, and I was one of them. We showed up to the board meeting and sat and waited. And before the item came up, one of the assistant superintendents came in. I was sitting next to my union president. She came up and she said, "Can I speak to you outside?" Went outside and said, "This is not happening. It is too controversial." So that ended it. I do want to say, thank you. I do want to say a few more things about what was actually being said. I called my union president immediately when we got this. I talked to her and she said, "Oh, I called the superintendent. The superintendent has assured me that these TFA people will be qualified, number one. Number two, they will be former alumni of our school district. And number three, they will have to interview for positions and will not be guaranteed a position." All three of those things were told to me. And I knew immediately, of course, that that was not true. It became very clear that the superintendent didn't even read the contract. Because all you had to do was open it up, read it, and everything that they were telling us was completely the opposite in that contract. So I said to my union president, "Please read this," and we went line by line, and she was outraged because she believed what he said as well, and she hadn't read it. She called him. I believe to this day that he had not read it either. He had been given these lines by somebody from the outside. I think we have a way of making these things happen. We have a way. We contact our school boards, but we don't let them get away with it, even if it is a 3 or 4 day notice. We read those packets that are coming. This would have been pushed through in a second if it wasn't for Julian, if it wasn't for Bats, and if it wasn't for people that were willing to not sleep for a few days.
I didn't say earlier why I quit working at Fordham University, where I was mentoring TFA people. And Jameson's story and Tina's story are really behind it. Because there's contracts that they have with the universities, too, that are sort of invisible. And there are kind of key phrases in there. And all of a sudden, after working there for 4 years, I was told that the university decided that all the TFA core members who the university had contracted with TFA to have them get their master's degree through Fordham and all the other universities as well, all of a sudden the university decided that they had to be co-certified, dual certified in special ed. And they said, "Well, you'll need to go work with them." And I said, "No. Number one, I'm not certified in special ed. And number two, I wouldn't know what the hell to teach them about teaching special ed, because the only contacts I've had with special ed are kids who are mainstreamed into my classes and working with resource people who are well trained in working with special ed kids." So they said, "Well, that's what we have." And I said, "Sayonara, I can't do that." So that was also one of the reasons that got me sparked into doing this. So the idea here, and I think there's a common theme here, is that not only has TFA become institutionalized, and not only is that their goal to become further institutionalized, it's also, interestingly enough, trying to be very visible, but at the same time very invisible in their methods. So I think going home, or wherever it is you have to go back to, I think as you organize and you fight for all the things we've come to this conference to organize and fight for, make sure that when you get back, since you're here in this room, that number one, you make what TFA does visible in your district. Loud and clear, and dig into those 500-page documents and find out, if you're working in a university, what that contract says. And then don't neglect to fight TFA as well, because they are an invisible cancer that's destroying our public school system.